Hello, everybody. Good evening. My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics, and we are pleased to welcome all of you this evening to an important discussion about religion and politics. Alejandra Hardin will formally introduce our guests in a few minutes. I wanted to let you know about a couple of upcoming events that we have this week and some housekeeping. So tomorrow, Tuesday, October 19th at 10 a.m. in this room, we're going to have David Axelrod, IOP's founding director, for a conversation with U.S. Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, who's the chairman of the House Democratic Caucus and a rising African-American leader in Congress. We'll hear all about the latest from Capitol Hill. You still have time to RSVP for that, so we hope you'll join us for that. On Wednesday, October 20th at 5:30 p.m. at the Quadrangle Club, we'll have a discussion regarding congressional redistricting with Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report and Ali Mutnick of Politico, who are going to be in conversation with Adam Kincaid of the National Republican Redistricting Trust and Kelly Burton of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. Audience questions. So after the moderated discussion, we'll open the floor up to take questions from you in the audience. Please line up. There'll be a mic in the middle. Please line up to ask your questions. And remember, everybody is welcome to the microphone. Please keep your mask on when you ask your question. And as usual, we'll give priority for student questions. And just a couple housekeeping things. Please make sure your phones are on silent. And now I'd like to welcome Alejandra Hardin to the stage. She's a third-year student in the college who's from Atlanta, Georgia. She's majoring in economics and minoring in history. She's the president of the Women in Economics, and she's the lead IOP Fellows Ambassador to Russell Moore, who's a fellow with us this quarter. Please join me in welcoming Alejandra to the podium. Welcome.
All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Faith and Democracy, the Role of Religion in American Politics. Today we'll be joined by panelists Russell Moore, Rachel Mikva, and Asma Uddin. Dr. Moore is currently an Institute of Politics Fellow on campus with a series focusing on evangelical Christianity in America. Dr. Moore is the director of the Public Theology Project at Christianity Today and previously served as president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, the public policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention, and was named one of Politico's top 50 influence makers in Washington. Mr. Moore is father to 5 sons and a country and folk music lover. Rachel Mikva is a Rabbi Herman Schallman Chair and Professor of Jewish Studies at the Chicago Theological Seminary and senior faculty at the Interreligious Institute. Before the Theological Seminary, Dr. Mikva served as a congregational rabbi for 13 years. Her book, Dangerous Religious Ideas, The Deep Roots of Self-Critical Faith in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, discusses some ideas that will be covered here today, specifically religion in the public square. Asma Uddin is a religious liberty lawyer and scholar working on protecting religious expression for all people of all faiths around the globe. After graduating from the UChicago Law School, she has gone to work on a number of religious liberty cases, including multiple before the Supreme Court. She has written several books, including Politics of Vulnerability, How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America, Today's Threat to Religion and Religious Freedom, and was an executive producer of the Emmy and Peabody-nominated docuseries, The Secret Life of Muslims. Our moderator today will be Brie Loskota, the executive director of the Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion. Throughout her career, Ms. Loskota has worked to increase religious pluralism for all faith communities. In 2017, Ms. Loskota was named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum. She is co-founder and senior advisor to the American Muslim Leadership Institute and co-created the Disaster in Religions Religious Literacy Competency app, which helps emergency responders serve diverse religious communities during disasters. Our speakers will be discussing the relationship between faith and democracy, how the two affect each other, whether faith contributes to polarization, and the widely known phrase, separation of church and state. As a fellow ambassador for Mr. Moore, I've been able to discuss the intersection of politics and religion one-on-one and hear about it in his seminars, specifically the interaction between faith and differing cultures in America and how faith can shape political views. I hope you all enjoy getting to hear from him and the other panelists. Thank you.
So religion and politics are the two things you're not supposed to talk about in polite company, but that's our task tonight. They permeate nearly every aspect of life, and they have been part of the American story since our beginning. Religious groups, moral and theological language, even congregations themselves are deployed for political aims that are often couched as moral aims as well. And they have been on every side of every issue in the public square. They can align with political parties like the moral majority, or they can completely eschew political interaction like the Jehovah's Witnesses. And there's a range of responses in between. The freedom to operate is enshrined in the Constitution. We all know it well. But some things that we may not know as well is the story of American religious pluralism. It dates back to our earliest days. So Washington, our new president, in 1790, wrote to a congregation of Jews in Rhode Island, and he said, "It is no more that toleration is spoken of as if it was the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving to it on all occasions their effectual support." It's a pretty high-minded call for tolerance in 1790. Just a few short years later, we see another call for religious pluralism in the Treaty of Tripoli. As the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws or religion or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said state never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinion should ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between these two countries. Both religious tolerance and the limitation on religion's role in international affairs shows up in 1797. President Obama famously quoted a portion of this speech in his landmark address to the Muslim world in Cairo. And all of this caught the eye of Alexis de Tocqueville 50 years later. He saw the flourishing and separation of the state and religion as part of the great contribution of the American experiment. He said, "On my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. And the longer I stayed there, the more I perceived the great political consequences resulting from this new state of things. In France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom marching in opposite directions. But in America, I found that they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country. Religion and politics intertwined." So these are all early forms of pluralism, of religion and politics, setting the stage for the security the state is supposed to provide for religion, and also the freedom and separation of it, its own limitations. America has always been a religiously plural place, but at the same time, a Christian majority where the defaults are set in Christian terms. The American story is always a complicated one. Washington's letter to a congregation extolling the virtues of tolerance is written in a slave-holding America. Martin Luther King observed that 11 a.m. on Sunday morning was America's most segregated hour. That remains true. So this story of religion and politics is a story of ideals and of realities, and they are profoundly contradictory at many times. So that's what we're going to explore today. We turn to our esteemed panel, and let's sort of map the territory of religion and politics. For some, we're talking about electoral politics, right? Getting souls to the polls is the famous campaign described, right? The instrumental use of politics for an electoral purpose. But that is not the only terrain of religion and politics. So how do the communities that you engage with think about themselves as religious actors, as political actors? And what is this terrain that we're talking about when we talk about religion, politics, and democracy? Rachel, since
I'm next to you.
You're next to me, I'll start with you.
Well, when I think about religion and politics in America, I think of numerous things. The first, of course, is electoral politics, and there, from my opinion, our record is spotty, because there are people who use religion for political purposes and who use politics for sectarian gain. And I think Dr. King was right when he taught us that religion is not supposed to be the master or the slave of the state, but the conscience of the state. So that brings me to a second role of religion, one more promising, I believe, in American politics, and that's a shaper of values, right? These are the languages that many of us use to talk about things that are most important to us and to explain to each other why that is. And I think that is a critical role of religion in American politics. But it lifts up also a third possibility, because we don't only meet each other around public policy, but also public schools and public space and public services. And so I think that religion does serve now in many ways as a laboratory for navigating difference. And we're doing better with religion right now, not perfectly, but better with religion right now than we are with politics. And I think that for having gotten it wrong for millennia, that which we've learned about navigating differences in religion, we might be able to take with us into getting better in our pandemic of polarization around politics.
Russell, you've worked at the intersection of these issues. Do you see it similarly?
Yes, I do. I think when I think of politics, I think of the way we work together in the civil arena in a variety of ways. The concern is that electoral politics, or at least the theatrical nature of participation in electoral politics, has changed and shifted almost every area of American life right now, and religion is included. So many congregations, whether be they churches or mosques or synagogues, will often face the exact same tensions that are happening in the outside world, often though fueled by social media, not just in terms of the interactions on social media, but also the way that social media changes the way we interact with one another. And so that has become a tension in many religious communities, certainly in mine. I would agree with the idea of religion as the conscience of the state, but specifically in this way. I think that religion shapes and forms the consciences of religious people. So in my community of evangelical Christianity, what I would hope for is similar to what we see in Scripture with a figure, John the Baptizer, who was calling people to repentance. And there were soldiers and tax collectors who said, "What do we do now?" And so there was a specific directive: don't extort, don't defraud people, don't use your power and abuse your power. So the conscience is being shaped and formed in order to carry out their responsibilities without the church dictating to the civil arena or the civil arena dictating to the church. I think that's the goal.
Asma, the interaction of the Muslim community with the public square has been something that's been deeply politicized. The high-minded calls that there would be no enmity between states from the Treaty of Tripoli seems like a bygone day, something that we could actually revive, right? And President Obama didn't quote that part of the 11th article of the Treaty of Tripoli in his speech in Cairo. So is there a way that you view this arena that's similar, and how does the Muslim community think about themselves as both religious and political actors in the American public square?
Sure. So I wrestled with these questions across my two books. And so the first book was When Islam is Not a Religion, Inside America's Fight for Religious Freedom. And in it, I actually talked about this claim that I heard being made in a court of law that a mosque should not be able to build, and Muslim community should not be able to build a mosque and benefit from religious land use protections because Islam is not a religion. It is a dangerous political ideology, and therefore Muslims don't get religious freedom. This is an argument that I heard in court, and where the U.S. Department of Justice in 2010 had to file an amicus brief explaining that in the United States, Islam is considered a religion. And at the time when working on this case, I was like, it was like kind of startling that the Department of Justice had to get involved in a case in Tennessee Chancery Court. kind of was like, oh, this is a fringe issue. But unfortunately, at the time that I started thinking about the book and writing it, we were in the middle of the Trump era, where unfortunately many of the people who had come up with this idea, these talking points and this broader sort of propaganda that Islam is not a religion and Muslims don't have rights under the Constitution, were actually quite close to the President of the United States. And so I felt very moved to write the book, not just because of the explicit claims being made in the legal arena, but I saw the sort of versions of that, maybe not said in so many words, but the bigger themes and that idea being at the center of so many policy battles as well. And then the second book kind of looked at this as to, the question was like, why? Like, why is this happening? Mm-hmm. And by the time I read the second book, I was very much contemplating, and this was just within a year of each other that I wrote the two books, thinking about like the state of polarization in this country, and in my own personal interactions working on religious liberty cases for a wide variety of religious groups, kind of noticing that there was like this weird sort of hypocrisy that among the people that were most strident and passionate about protecting religious freedom, oftentimes this argument that Islam was not a religion and Muslims don't have religious freedom was kind of coming from many of those same people. I'm not saying all of the same people, but there was an overlap there. And it really got me thinking, and I diagnosed it in the second book by looking at the sort of overlap between political identities and religious identities, which I think we can get into a little bit later. Mm-hmm. But so there's a number of ways to think about that. Like one, in the book, it's called The Politics of Vulnerability: How to Heal Muslim-Christian Relations in a Post-Christian America. I look at mostly how this conservative, white Christian community sees Muslims as sort of both a political outgroup and a religious outgroup. So that's one lens. Then there's a lens of how do the political parties themselves see these two groups. Mm-hmm. And then the question that you pose, which is how does the Muslim community see itself? And on that, it's many Muslims, not all, but I say many. For them, it's a pretty simple calculus. There's one set of spokespeople for one political group that makes it a point to constantly sort of beat up on Muslims. And I think we saw that on full display, for example, in 2016, the campaign, and throughout the Trump era, unfortunately. And then you have another set of people who, at least in a very sort of surface level, seem to be very much embracing and championing, and often very deep and meaningful ways too, Muslims' rights. And so it seems like a pretty easy calculus. And so you begin to see yourself as necessarily a religious community that is not welcome in one group and very much welcome in another. And so what you see happening among many activists is this idea that there's not just Muslims against this group, but now there's an array of other minorities. They're also sort of being beat up or in conflict with this other group. And so there's a lot of coalition building happening there in a way. So that's a way of negotiating both religious and political identity. And what we see happening now is that there are people in the Muslim community, scholars and other activists, who are kind of pushing back and say, well, maybe that's a little bit too simplistic of a formula in terms of deciding our political objectives. And so those are, again, complexities that we can get into later.
It's an interesting shift, though. In the 2000 election, Muslim national organizations were very much pro-Republican. They endorsed, many of them who made endorsements as Muslim leaders endorsed Bush. So there was a realignment that happened in the last 20 years. Do you attribute that to the war on terror, or are there other political forces and cultural forces that are happening in the Muslim community?
Yeah, so as you know, there was a significant shift. So you have 2-to-1 support for George H.W. Bush, and then Muslims supported Bill Clinton, but then 70% voted for George W. Bush, 90%. But then there was a flip because of both foreign policy. The sort of torture at Abu Ghraib was a big issue, and also because of the rise of these very sort of strident anti-Muslim statements. And from that point forward, the flip towards Democrats has stayed consistent, right? So 90% of the Muslim community voted for John Kerry, 89% and 85% in Obama's 2 elections, about 76% for Hillary, and then similar for Biden. I know that Brie knows that there's some interesting polling evidence that there was actually an increase in number of people who voted for, number of Muslims who voted for Trump in his second go-around. But by and large, the vast majority of the community is voting for Democrats. And again, it's 2 things. As far as, from the commentary analyses, it usually attributes it to one, foreign policy, And then the sort of simple fact, just kind of see what's going on TV and who's beating up on you.
Now, there's a sort of political alignment that's similar in the evangelical community. Much was made of the 85% of white evangelicals that voted for Trump in exit polls. Do you see a realignment that may happen? Is that going to stay? If you were prognosticating to the future, what would you hope to see, and what are you seeing on the ground in terms of the staying power of that number?
Well, the shift that I see happening is not from right to left or left to right or from one party to the other, but a generational change in terms of how people interact with politics and with politicians specifically. So the younger generation of American evangelicals generally are very suspicious of any cynical use of religion for political purposes. So sometimes I will have people who are elected officials who are thinking about running for president who will say, can you let me know what the growing dynamic evangelical congregations are in Iowa or South Carolina or such places? And I will always say, I can tell you where they are, but I can also tell you they would never have you get up and speak when you're running for office. And they would never give you their church directories in order to mobilize people to get to a caucus. Not because they disapprove of you necessarily, but because they see that as an instance of Christianity specifically as a means to an end, and are really, in many cases, almost overreactive to the very politicized nature of much of religion over the past 20 years, to the point of sometimes a withdrawal altogether from political life, which my argument is gets you to the same place, because this withdrawal means that you simply are cordoning off and siloing off your ultimate commitments from your penultimate commitments, and that means that you have people being shaped and formed politically by cable news and social media and so forth. So that's the shift that I see happening within evangelicalism, but it's not one that is moving an activist group from one set of politicians to another. I don't see that happen.
Do you see any similar trends that are happening in the Jewish community? Is it electoral politics staying stably aligned with the Democratic Party, or is there nuance that's happening there?
About 3/4 of the Jewish community has voted Democratic since Roosevelt. And I don't see those numbers changing significantly unless the questions around Israel continue to become partisan questions. Right? It hasn't been a partisan issue. They have different ways of approaching the challenges of Israel and Palestine, but I foresee if I was a prognosticator, which I am not, I would foresee the Jewish community remaining significantly in the Democratic camp. I think that to say as a Reformed Jew, I care about the climate crisis and immigrants and supporting people who are disadvantaged or marginalized and justice for Israel and for Palestinians and for all the peoples who live in that land and a host of other issues is all fine. Right? These are my commitments. They're informed by my faith. But to say that Reform Judaism is that, or white evangelical Christianity is this political party, or vice versa, is really bad for religion, really bad for democracy.
In what ways is it bad for religion? I mean, this is something that de Tocqueville points out, right? That when religion gets involved in politics, it loses its universalizing moral voice.
I'm sorry, I must not have been clear. I don't mean when religion gets involved in politics, because I think a lot of our faiths tell us to be engaged in the public square and to help make the world that our faith tells us would be a better one. But the equation of, if you are a Reformed Jew, you must be these things because this identity of faith is this political position. Marginalizes people inside our community for whom that's not their political position, and cheapens what it is we hope that faith is doing, right? It tells us, it's kind of what you were trying to say earlier, and you said better than I'm about to. So, but it should inform our actions in the public square, not dictate the politics of the place.
And yet there are many political parties that would like to use religion in that way, right? And there are religious actors who willingly go along in that vein. So how do we find a balance, or how do we counteract the forces of instrumentalization of religion, or the sort of co-option of the state for religious aims? I mean, that seems to be an ongoing theme with what is happening in our politics today.
Yes, and to some degree, it always has been the great temptation. There was an old Texas Baptist preacher who used to say, everyone wants theocracy, and everyone wants to be Theo. And that certainly does tend to be the case. The fallen, in my view, human desire for power over other people will use any means to get there. So we can see that not only in the way that electoral politics is used on the right and the left when it comes to religion, but also look at, for instance, the Russian government and the relationship with the Russian Orthodox Church and with minority religions there. I mean, you can see this in almost every part of the world. For me, that's bad for democracy, yes, but I'm more concerned about what it does to the gospel, which is not a means to an end. There was a Presbyterian theologian in the early 20th century who contrasted Christianity with liberalism, by which he didn't mean liberal democracy or the political left. What he meant by that is the instrumentalizing of Christianity. So he warned about, for instance, the temptation to see Christianity as a means of fighting communism. Does Christianity oppose communism? He argued, yes. But if Christianity is simply the means to draw people away from communism, then Christianity has become something other than an actual gospel. So for me, one of the primary objectives is to let people know that we can be Americans best when we're not Americans first. When we come to our responsibilities as citizens, as people who have a different and a higher identity, so that one of the problems that we see right now in political life is that the stakes are so drastically high on everything, because so many of the arguments that we're having, and an increasing number of the arguments we're having, aren't really about policy. They're about who we are, my identity versus your identity. And when a political position is different than mine, it feels like an existential threat. And so having people who are shaped and formed by more ultimate concerns is what, in my view, at least my religion, should be about. And I think that that's healthier for democracy.
Can I follow up on, so what to you would be the difference between saying Christianity opposes communism versus I, as a Christian, oppose communism?
Well, I think the difference is that Christianity is the religion itself. It's those set of ultimate beliefs, receiving the gospel and following Jesus Christ. But it's not a means to an earthly end. That does, though, have implications. In the same way it does with all of our relationships. So, for instance, in terms of family life, does Christianity speak to family life? Yes. There are multiple passages in the New Testament talking about the way that families are to relate to one another. If, though, Christianity is a means of getting healthier families, healthier marriages, or healthier parenting, as opposed to that being an implication of it, then the end goal is actually family, rather than what happens when people are shaped and formed by seeing themselves in a larger span of time. They belong to a global, in my view, a global body of Christ that transcends Earth, transcends those who are presently living. So there's a constant sense of reminder as to who I am in a way that's not threatened by the momentary skirmishes.
Thanks for that clarification. I just wanted to explain the reason I asked was I teach at a seminary where a lot of the students are Christian and several of them are communists. So the idea of speaking from rather than for is what I was getting at, but I really appreciate the clarification.
So it's interesting that you're talking about institutions that form people and the notions of identity and politics that come together, because I'm thinking about the way that the moral majority and the religious right were formed, which is really in reaction to, not to abortion, but to forced integration, right? The advent of the civil rights movement being asking Bob Jones University to integrate its students. And so the notion of religious freedom is something that becomes a sort of ultimate right? A right that trumps, to coin a phrase, other rights, is being deployed in almost all of our political discussions. Asma, your work touches on this really profoundly in the way that religious freedom, what are the limits of religious freedom? It touches on all of these issues that we're negotiating in the public square and has for a very long time, but very acutely from the 70s forward. So how do we think about religious freedom and where civil rights intersect or where culture war issues intersect as we negotiate that? Because it's one thing to talk about, high ideals, but those inform the choices that we're making as a whole society.
Yeah, I mean, that's the biggest question right now facing religious freedom. Even in the course of just my decade of work in the space, I sort of started off in the space when things were relatively not political. It was like we had sort of major issues were the ability to set up a religious display on government property. That was the major source of contention. And I was halfway through my first decade when I actually worked on the Hobby Lobby case that was decided in 2014, and I felt like this palpable change. And for those of you who don't know what that case is about, it's about the Hobby Lobby craft chain that's owned by a fundamentalist Protestant family, the Green family, who have specific beliefs about two of the drugs and two devices that were required under the Affordable Care Act that they consider to be abortifacients, and they said that we would not be covering these. We don't want to cover these in our employee health insurance plan because doing so would violate our religious beliefs. And so my firm represented Hobby Lobby and won 5-4 at the Supreme Court. And for me, it was just really interesting as a young lawyer kind of being in that space because it was such a sea change. In terms of, there was a lot of tension building up to that because a number of Catholic entities have brought challenges against the Affordable Care Act in opposition to all the contraception that was required. So there was lots of the media storm had already been brewing. But once that case was decided, it was just like I could feel, and I do credit that as a trigger sort of for the current iteration of the religious liberty culture war. And the question now has consistently been what are the limits? Exactly the way that you posed it. There was a time when religious freedom was, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was something that was passed in response to a Supreme Court case that essentially watered down the standard of review for religious liberty challenges, and it was a bipartisan coalition. It was like the ACLU working with the most conservative groups, and everybody agreed that we need really robust religious freedom protections. And now, I think it was in 2000 and probably 15, soon after Hobby Lobby, that the ACLU officially declared that we are no longer supporting Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Instead, there's an alternative legislation called the Do No Harm Act, basically saying that religious liberty claims end where there is, a cognizable, or this sort of a third-party harm, and they're sort of delineated sort of third-party harms that they think should constitute the limit. And so for me, it's always been an interesting space to be in because on the one hand, I'm obviously working on these really contentious cases that are mostly brought by and involved traditional Christian beliefs. But on the flip side, and exactly the ones that are being challenged in the public square so passionately, but then also belonging to a religious community, and not just a minority religious community, and not just any minority religious community, but the precise one that often tends to get dismissed, if not outright attacked by, unfortunately, many conservative Christians. And so, just to be able to navigate that and to be able to sort of maintain a position of integrity has been an interesting exercise for me. And for me, it's really helped that I have approached that from the perspective of law. Being involved in these cases, I'm like, it's not actually a political question. And I am somebody who actually does think that justices are humans and therefore have ideology, and that comes into play. But I don't think that they are political actors. And there's a legal standard in play, and it's quite simple for me. Like in the Hobby Lobby case, I was like, I don't really understand, I guess, what the problem is, because there was a legal standard, and they applied the standard, and the government didn't meet the standard, therefore you lose. Do a better job next time, right? And so for me, it's like, that's how I determine the limits. Like the standard is that if there's a compelling government interest, then you show the compelling government interest and show that this is the least restrictive way of serving that interest. And so if you can do that, then religious freedom claims lose. And if you can't do that, then the religious claimant wins.
So religious freedom claims won in California, where I just moved from, because when it related to COVID. So there were orders about requirements. Religion was classified as something that was non-essential, which was a mistake, I would say, to add some commentary. And it provoked a backlash, a congregational backlash that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And they said that you cannot restrict in-person worship in ways that are different than other forms of in-person activity. But then that creates a problem for things like religious exemptions that people are claiming now for vaccines. So how do we create coherent public policy when religious freedom is being used as a sort of get out of the thing I don't like card? And that may not be the intention, but it's instrumental use, right? That people are just saying, I have a religious objection, which seems to also be coded as a political objection.
Even if it's faithful use, there's often still third-party harm. So freedom of religion cases are frequently now, before the vaccine became the most common issue, they're around freedom to discriminate, right? And there was a privileging of religious freedom over other freedoms. And that I think it does become a political question when you start having to tease out the ways that we rank it, right? So the Talmud is not a political document, but they stick one value here and the other value here, and they put them in tension to try to figure it out. And I think that's what we're frequently doing. We're trying to balance the rights that we hold dear when they come into conflict. And so even people who are faithfully using their religious objections to vaccines are not, I think, the conversation is not sufficiently robustly engaging what are the things that are in competition with that, and the religious claims do not get to go up here above these other concerns around public health.
We already have a standard to deal with these issues of religious exemption in exactly the way that we just talked about. There is a compelling government interest for public health. The state can show that, and the state has been able for 100 years to show how to have vaccination policies, public health policies, in a way that is the least restrictive way to get that without impeding people's religious convictions. So, for instance, in the cases about COVID restrictions in places where there was a legitimate restriction of everyone, those cases tended to go in the direction of the state. In those places where the state treated as, for instance, Nevada, that would allow in-person gatherings in casinos but not in churches, the state tended to lose. Everyone agrees that religious freedom, as every freedom, has limits. There is no religious liberty to human sacrifice, for instance. No one is arguing that. But the question is, when we have a heritage of religious freedom, we have the tools already to decide these questions. What I find myself typically doing, if you look at Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind with the different intuitional ways of looking at these things, is when I'm talking to people on the right who want to restrict the religious liberty of others, as we've already been talking about, with, say, zoning mosques out of existence, is after I've talked about the theological reasons why that's wrong, is then to say, don't you see how the very same method of mistreating this group of people will be used against you? And then when I'm talking to people on the left, I usually point to minority religion concerns. So yes, we've had a lot of very high-profile cases that have to do with rather incendiary culture war issues. That's actually not the majority of them, but that's the majority of those that we talk about. No one's going to lead cable news talking about the case dealing with, for instance, Native American eagle feathers or the right of Sikhs to wear beards in the United States military. It doesn't fit into a culture war narrative, but those are the issues we have to decide, and we have the tools to do it.
Are there any other issues that you see on the horizon that are sort of purple, right, that are blurring the polarization debate, that are bringing us closer together? Because it seems as though the terrain is getting increasingly entrenched, that the sides are moving further apart rather than closer together, maybe in some ways even meeting each other at the curve of those poles. But do you see that there is any sort of hope for anything that might look like what politics ultimately is about negotiation and compromise on these issues that are moral, on these issues that are, moral and political together?
Who are you asking?
Anyone who'd like to give us a moment of hope for the purpling of our political discourse.
Well, I quote the old environmental activist Edward Abbey often, who said, I think it was Abbey who said, I'm a short-term pessimist and a long-term optimist, and by short-term I mean the next 5,000 years. I don't have quite that long of a view, but I don't think that the way we're operating now is ultimately sustainable. I think there is a level of exhaustion that's there. But one of the problems, and this for the foreseeable future is right in front of us, one of the problems is there aren't many training grounds for conflict resolution. Often when you have people who get together in coalitions working on an issue that hasn't become claimed by some tribal group in American politics, they then can find ways of consensus that can move outward to other issues. There are fewer and fewer of those right now, and that ought to be of concern to all of us.
I'm not sure I'm not sure I believe in newly emerging purple issues that will draw the country together, but I might believe in people being able to think and understand both red and blue. And, Kathleen Kavanagh talked about the difference between condemn and contempt. You can feel very strongly about an issue and even, be out on the streets and be an activist on it and still not look at the people who disagree with you with contempt. I think that we'd be better off as a democracy. I even think if we don't imagine that the people on the other side lack moral capacity, right? And I think even strategically, if we're hoping to change hearts and minds, we're going to be better off if we believe they have a heart.
Yeah.
And so I believe in purple people.
Great.
Yeah, I don't know if I can identify a purple issue. If we're talking about religious communities and politics, which we are, I think that a common concern is the rise of the nuns, right? People who aren't affiliated with the religion and sort of rising secularity and what many people sort of perceive as a threat to the status of religion and to the appreciation of religion in this country. I think that's something that a lot of religious communities, even from different sort of political standpoints, can probably come together on. But I think my response is really similar to Rachel's in the sense that it's not so much there's a new issue, it's the ability to get people from each side kind of come together and have a different perspective on an existing issue in a way that they can actually work together. And so in the book, for example, in the second book, I actually talk about religious freedom being one of those things. And reading the political science literature, a lot of political scientists are like, we don't really see what that issue is that can lead to unsorting. That's like the word they say. How do we unsort out of our respective tribes? And they're like, there's not enough respect for authority. And that's like one of the preconditions in order for that to happen. And I still see unique potential in religious freedom. That's why I find that so intriguing as a possibility, because kind of the types of things that Russell was talking about, just that once you begin to kind of see it through a different lens, when, by the way, there are existing sort of political science studies where these researchers have actually done this. So they'll present, for example, to a left-leaning group a series of religious freedom deprivations concerning Muslims and for Hindus, but the Muslims ones are actually the most salient. And so, for example, this Muslim truck driver, was forced to transport alcohol even though it was against his religious belief. Should that person have an exemption? And then, and then after that, we'll present sort of a classic culture war Christian issue, like the Christian cake baker. And we'll find that this left-leaning audience is actually more receptive to the cake baker situation once they've been primed with this Muslim example. And so I think that there's something there just in the way that we're approaching these things, and once we kind of start seeing them through these other lenses and understanding them in a broader context, that it kind of moves people to see things differently, and that might be sort of a new purple flame.
There's also sociological evidence that once you successfully navigate one difference, it actually helps you to navigate other ones. So it kind of fits in with that.
Yeah.
Right, and I also think of this as sort of as a starting point. Like if we can figure out, so when I say how to heal Muslim-Christian relations, it's sort of like, I really talk about it as this microcosm, right? Like it's sort of this case study. If we can figure this thing out and sort of tease apart all the different pieces of this, the religious, the political, and so on, I think this can provide a blueprint for healing other types of divides.
So if we're talking about ultimate concerns, and we're going to move to questions in a second, so start to get those ready, all of this might seem quaint to somebody who's looking at America through a post-January 6th lens, where it's not about politics of compromise. It's about blood sport. It's about a seizing of power in the name of white Christian nationalism that is activating something that can't really be compromised with. So do we have the tools to fight the fights that are coming down the road in our politics and our religious institutions? Because it might seem like we're coming up short in light of January 6th.
Only if we can persuade people that having shofar-blowing insurrectionists and people carrying crosses and Jesus Saves banners alongside the Trump banners and the invasion of the Capitol, that's as bad for religion as it is for democracy. That the idea of white Christian nationalism is really bad for Christianity. I mean, it will destroy it. And if we can persuade people of that, then we can get past it.
Yes, I'm fearful of, Wendell Berry warned about the cause of desperate times calls for desperate measures, which enables people to say, because the times are so dire, it means that these people are not human. And this is a dangerous temptation for us. I fear the country getting to that point, at which point there will be no ability to come back from it that I can see. But when it comes to white Christian nationalism, if we're defining it correctly, I mean, there are people who were warning about the theocratic takeover of America in the George H.W. Bush administration. I don't take that seriously. But when we're talking about actual Christian nationalism, my problem with that is one thing as an American. I'm concerned about that as an American. Even more so, I'm concerned about it because it's heresy. And it actually is a competition with the gospel of Jesus Christ. I think most evangelical Christians turned in horror from January 6th. The question is then, how do you learn the lessons from January 6th? I was on a Christian radio station one time after January 6th, and a caller called in and said, I had been critiquing the Jesus Saves sign and everything else there, and the caller said, well, how do you know if you're participating in something that's, and I said, well, if they're building a gallows, leave. Just that's the base level rule. We can go beyond that, but that should be sort of lowest common denominator. So I think we have enough in terms of the way that Americans have navigated this. What worries me is when I look at Europe, and I see some of the populist movements emerging there. That's what concerns me.
That's great.
So, one of the first things I do in the book, because the questions, there's a part 2 is called Which Christians, right? Because the question is, which Christians do I think are actually potentially, people we can bridge veiled with? And so I spent a lot of time using different studies to distinguish between white Christian nationalists and white conservative evangelicals, for example. And there's lots of different things that, that distinguish these two. One tends to use religion in the service of political goals, whereas the other group is more focused on religion and religious goals, right? And not interested in the politics. So I spent a lot of time sort of distinguishing the two, and I think it's important to distinguish them. I think I sort of come from this also being a member of a community that tends to be treated as a monolith. So I'm like, I'm not going to turn around and do that to someone else. But then, there's also a bunch of other studies that I talk about where even if you don't hold these beliefs, these really problematic beliefs, you just kind of go along with it. Because it's sort of the dynamics of group identity, and especially a group that feels under threat, which a lot of conservative Christians do in this country, that they're just like, well, our options are these people, and these people, they're saying a bunch of stuff that we don't really agree with, but it's kind of closer to it, and ultimately they're defending the things that we're worried about, so we'll just go along with it and maybe mostly be silent about those things. And I think what January 6th did is some of the responses that I saw coming out, especially including by Russell, was just a realization that we can't just be silent, that this is getting out of control, and a lot of these people are speaking for us, and they shouldn't be.
I think there's also been some interesting reckoning with the role that religion does play in facilitating it, right? Because we've always dealt with ultimacy, with the kinds of questions that have sometimes felt like they supersede everything else, right? Including sometimes other values that we hold dear. And it historically authorized holy war. So we have to reckon with the real role that religion plays at the same time that we are concerned about the, saving religion from it.
We'll move now to questions. There is a mic in the center. Now, we've been dealing with politics, which is the realm of speeches, religion, which is the realm of sermons, and when you open stuff up to audience, you often get statements. But we are interested in your actual questions. So if you could keep your questions brief, and also Institute of Politics is a practice of making sure that there's gender diversity in questions, so please also make space for everyone to get a chance to ask their question.
Hello, my name is Shashank. I'm a first-year Master's of Divinity student at the Divinity School, and so I realize this evening's conversation has primarily talked about domestic politics, and something that concerns me personally as a Hindu in America is like the number of minority religious communities who are implicated in international issues. And it was very, very briefly touched upon in the issue of like Israel and Palestine. But my question is like, how do you address like Americans whose religions and their politics are very deeply intertwined with international issues? Like, for example, a lot of Hindus in America, their participation in politics is often directly conditioned by whether or not they think that America is allying itself with India versus quote-unquote Muslim countries. And that like colors a lot of our politics. That includes sort of progressives within the South Asian community who like criticize Raja Krishnamurti for speaking at the Global Hindu Congress. Like, I guess like my question fundamentally is like, what is like the place of like American religious conscience when talking about international issues? And it's like not just about like Hindus, but like also like for Muslims who feel I imagine very directly affected by America's sort of contribution to a lot of issues in like the Islamic world. So thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to help broaden our conversation out to the interplay of the international?
I mean, I don't know that I have a great answer. I know that within the community, there's a lot of discussion always about how American Muslims have to start thinking about themselves as American Muslims. You see a lot of mosques being sort of separated by which country you're from, or the South Asian mosque versus the Arab mosque. And political participation for a long time was very much similar to what was just described. I think Trump changed that, and I think you see a lot more Muslims running for office and focusing more on domestic issues and domestic policies, of course, and the community is also growing. Half the community roughly is immigrant Muslims, the other half indigenous, and so that half is now kind of, as we get into the third and fourth generations, focusing more on what is relevant in terms of our place in this country as opposed to our connection abroad. So I think it's just kind of a reminder also in a way sort of what comes with the growth and maturation of the community. The way that I sort of confront this question is more from the opposite end, which tends to be so much hostility toward the Muslim community in the US tends to come from a place where we're all just sort of conflated with and merged with Muslims abroad. In fact, even this idea of Islam is not a religion is sort of, if you look at the justifications for it, it's just they'll point to XYZ authoritarian Muslim state, assume that all Muslim majority states are like that, and there's something inherent to having a Muslim majority and authoritarianism, which, by the way, is not true. A full quarter of Muslim majority states are considered religiously free, have broad religious freedom protections. You have about 40% of the remaining who are considered secular and actually punish Muslims often worse than other religious believers. And then others that are authoritarian but don't have support from the majority of the population for those policies. So, but oftentimes are considered one and the same, and Islam is sort of thought of through these terms, and then the treatment of Muslims here happens through that lens.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, in my community, I'm often having to do the reverse, which is reminding people both within and without that most evangelical Christians are not American, not middle class, and have never spoken English. And we belong to a community that is global. And then speaking to the outside world in a way that often very secular people tend to think of evangelical Christians as like cicadas that go into dormancy in between Iowa caucuses, and that they're simply that there's more to it than that. But when it comes to the experience that you're talking about, I think we have good precedent in American life for those concerns and those concerns being alleviated. So, for instance, the first wave of immigrants from Italy or Ireland, the concern at the time is they'll never assimilate. They think of themselves as Irish. They think of themselves as Italian. They don't think of themselves as Americans. Well, that's demonstrably not true when you see the way that the country is the current president is an Irish-American president. No one even thought about whether or not he would be more loyal to Ireland than to the United States. So I think that probably takes care of itself over time.
I think that at the same time, we also need to be able to affirm within the diversities of religiously minoritized communities here in America that does not diminish your patriotism or your American identity to be concerned about the homeland where you came from, right? That's a legitimate concern, that we don't lump everybody together and say, well, if you're from India, then you must think X, or if you're Hindu, then you must think X. And which Hindus, right? Which Christians, which Hindus. And while we're embracing that diversity of diversities, I just lost my train of thought. Just went right out of my head. It's gone.
Well, one thing I love that Mary Robinson did, who was the president of Ireland, she hung a lantern in her home to signal to the Irish diaspora that they would always have a place in Ireland. And so I do think that it's about, in some ways, this dialogue that happens about the way people form identities and where home can be in multiple places. And there has to be something that is more welcoming than just a binary decision. You're either us or you're them.
Right. Actually reminded me what I was going to say. I would hate to see it also be instrumentalized, right? And for being, outreach to the Hindu community be instrumentalized for political purposes because we'll give you what you want around our policies around our relationship with India versus Pakistan or other surrounding countries. So there's a danger in having our religious identity instrumentalized by political forces.
Great. Let's go to the next question.
Hi, my name is Rebecca. I'm a second year in the college, and I'm wondering what the panelists think about involving politics in a sermon in any religious group's context. I was interested by the comment about a very high percentage of Reform Jews being liberal, and it made me think about kind of this past year and how in my congregation there's been increasingly more politics involved in the sermons, particularly like with COVID and just a lot of other issues. And I know on my behalf it's welcomed because it aligns, but I'm wondering what you think about that. Thank you.
Well, I'll go first since it comes up from my comment, but invite your responses as well. I think that different religious leaders feel very differently about this, and different religious communities can feel very differently within the same movements, within the same denominations. I happen to be a very political rabbi. That worked pretty well when I was in an urban congregation, and not quite as well when I was at a suburban one. You have to find the spiritual home that matches your voice. But of course, it can't be partisan politics, right? And it has to be speaking from the tradition in an authentic way. And within Jewish tradition, I would have to say, also needs to recognize the multiplicity within that tradition that may affirm what you want to say, but also has questions and other ideas as well.
This is a point of great tension in my community. And usually what I do is to say, you already know how to do this because you do it with personal moral questions. There are some things with which you have the authority to speak. We believe as Christians, people shouldn't kill one another, for instance. Then there may be other issues where we have principles, but there are not specific applications that are going to go to everybody. And then other questions where we have freedom of conscience, we don't talk about those things, and to use the authority of the pulpit to talk about those things would be a misuse of the use of the pulpit. So I think the same thing applies when it comes to political questions. It's a difficult question to answer because you have to ask in every case, how is the person defining politics? So there will be a pastor who will face the same person who will say you're not political enough because you haven't denounced the government for COVID restrictions, and who will say you're too political because you prayed for the family of George Floyd, or vice versa. And so there's a sense in which sometimes what people mean by politics is any appeal to my conscience on an issue I don't want you to talk about. Just as there are often people who will say legalism and authoritarianism when speaking to any moral issue that they don't want to talk about. But there isn't a place for partisan electoral politics, in my view, and there has to be a constant sort of pulling away from that in a time when political identities really have become at best theatrical, at worst ultimate.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything that's been said. I think, I sort of alluded to, like, in my earlier statements about a push among some scholars and thinkers in the community to sort of begin to question the coalitions are happening on the basis of very sort of simple assumptions about where liberals and conservatives fall on things and who we should ally with. And I think the response that I've always heard is, like, it's not that easy. It's not about joining one group or the other, but to understand that there's such a variety of the Muslim beliefs do not align perfectly with conservative ideology versus liberal ideology, and to understand that from a place of religious authenticity. So to the extent that I would support religious leaders kind of speaking publicly about this, not just in terms of sermons, but also articles and lectures outside houses of worship, discussion groups, really getting involved so that people can kind of come to this. They often think they're coming at it from the place of religion, but it tends to be a really superficial understanding of their religion, and just to kind of help them develop more sort of authentic basis upon which they're engaging with these issues.
And it sounds like we're talking also about congregations as a place where people learn that process of deliberation, and then learning also with the tension of what it means to be in community with each other, despite and amongst and living with a sort of thriving sense of difference. Right, that the congregations may be one of the only places that we are kind of habituated to that type of communal activity, which I think is a really to go to your point of where do we learn how to do this? In many places, that was congregations.
Hi, my name is Frances Kavanaugh, and I'm a first-year Master's of Public Policy student at the Harris School. And so you all spoke about religion kind of serving as like the public conscious, like something we all have in common. And in U.S. U.S. history, religion has underpinned a lot of the social capital that's driven social and policy change, such as like reforms under the civil rights era. So do you see religion as still being the common factor underpinning social capital growth or development within a community, within communities throughout the U.S.? And if not, is that a problem for policy change? And if not, if religion is not what underpins our social capital, what is our commonality?
Russell, do you want to take that one?
Yes, this is changing. It is something that concerns me greatly on not just the stereotypical secularizing left, but also on the right. Ross Douthat of the New York Times said once, if you hated the religious right, just wait until you meet the post-religious right. And that's indeed the case when you look at European-style blood and soil right and a secularizing left. There isn't often a point of connection there in ways that I think could contribute to the fraying of American life. That's going to be something that we're going to have to work on without trying to impose some superficial form of lowest common denominator religion. But it's always going to be the case that for a significant portion of the population, they are going to be shaped and formed by their religious communities. That's not going to change. And so the myth of secularization as inevitable everywhere simply isn't true globally. And so we have to take that into account.
Any quick ones to add, and then we want to move through the rest of the questions.
I think that we have to begin to imagine religion differently and more broadly in our current climate, and the congregationally based historical denominations that drove social change may or may not be able to continue to play that role, but social movements have spiritual drives. The Black Lives Matter movement has a deep spirituality informed by diverse interspiritual dimensions, and I think that will continue to be a factor in social change and social movements as long as we can begin to imagine religion differently.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that there was a recent study by the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding that asked the Muslim community about whether they support coalition building with, for example, LGBTQ groups or BLM or so on. And what was interesting is that in each case they said that the decision about whether or not to form a coalition or to work, to engage in coalition building was not driven by religiosity, but was driven by partisanship, by partisan ideology. And so just the way that it kind of shows that the questions about who we're engaging with and what our priorities are in the public space are being driven, in this case, by something that's not religion. And to me, the worrying part of that is just that it kind of fits into, again, the way that partisan ideology is once again the inspiration behind so many of our decisions. And I think that's the type of thing that many people who are kind of noticing these effects of polarization are really worried about. And so, for example, in my book, I kind of talk about different sort of social scientific strategies and how to bring people from opposing groups together. And what's interesting about it is that so much of those same sorts of ideas are very much embedded in our religious traditions. And I almost want to insist that, yes, polarization is a problem, religious polarization is a problem, but religious polarization must necessarily be different from other types of polarization because it's religion. And so many of our religions are kind of, focused on this idea that we are fallible. There's so much of this other stuff is kind of driven by this idea that we have the right answer and the other person is necessarily wrong. And also evil, often. But you understand yourself instead and sort of kind of always sort of fumbling toward the truth and trying your best to approximate it, but you don't really know, then it's just a different starting point and a different sort of motivation to try to understand people who are different from you.
My name is John. I retired from the law library. My question has to do with the continuing pressure, at least as I see it, for division. Just in the last couple of weeks, evangelicals decided that the Organization for Colleges and Universities wasn't conservative enough, So a new group has been organized. A couple of years ago, evangelicals in general, some decided that the evangelical organization wasn't conservative enough, so another organization. There's huge tension within the Roman Catholic Church. My question is, are we spending enough time naming all the divisions so that we know what we're up against? I'm all for, and everyone in this room wants the dialogue that you're concerned about generating. But I just keep seeing a constant pressure for division.
I think it's there, but I think if that's what we focus on, we feed it. I think we have to find people with common cause who want to talk about issues that matter, even though we disagree, and work at them. And the more we focus on that, then that becomes our reality.
I have this conversation about 10 times a day with pastors, some in 30-person church plants, some in mega churches, that are experiencing what seems to be a global nervous breakdown that does not know the typical boundaries of political ideology or religion or anything else. Almost every institution in American life, and in many cases in global life, is under great tension and pressure and division right now. And so what I typically say to pastors, I have good news and bad news, and it's the same. This is everywhere. The good news is you're not the only one experiencing this. The bad news is there's not an island of refuge to swim to. We're all experiencing this. People have different ideas about why. But I think we can't wait in any community for all of us to be ready to work together before some of us do. Otherwise, we never will.
We're on the sort of tail end of our time here, so we're going to take a couple more questions, and we'll ask our answers to be brief and the questions to be brief.
Do you want to take more than one?
Yeah, we can batch them. We'll take go for it, quickly.
Good evening. My name's Austin. I'm a first year in the college. You briefly touched on the growing number of Americans who identify as religiously unaffiliated or agnostic or something similar. But there's also a body of research that suggests that Americans aren't quite ready to trust atheists in positions of power, especially when it comes to decision-making and having a moral compass. What would you envision as the future of atheism or agnosticism as a political force in this country?
Great, and let's take the next one.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm also a first year in the college, and my question was, in your ideal world, would politicians talk publicly about religion, and if so, how would they do that in a concrete way?
So those are a little related even. Who wants to start?
For the first one, I mean, I just wanted to point out that the rise, the nuns and the people who are unaffiliated, it's not the same as atheists and agnostics, and I think that's an important point to sort of flesh out, because it's just, if you can be unaffiliated but still very religious. And so that's the only, I mean, I don't know if I can speak to the future of agnosticism. And the second thing, I do think politicians should be able to speak, to bring religion into what they say. I would say make it as inclusive as possible, and sort of speak from the sources of your faith that are there for protecting rights for everyone and robustly. But I don't think there's anything in our law or our culture or tradition that says that drawing from your religion in the public space is wrong.
Yeah, I think that there definitely is a place for people, including politicians, to talk about how their deepest principles and values are formed. But there's a line that's there when that sort of rhetoric is used in order to mobilize some group or to demonize some other group. That's when it becomes very dangerous. But I don't have a problem with political leaders telling us how they're shaped and formed. I think if they don't, that's a problem too.
I would agree with the rest of the panel on the second question. On the first, I think it's important, I also agree with you what you said about that too, Asma, but I think it's important to recognize first, to reimagine how we think about secularism, which is not the eradication of religion from the public square, but a balancing of all of the claims for meaning in the way that we navigate our public lives together. And religion is one of those, and it is protected but not privileged among the others. And I think if we can begin to see secularism in that way, then we can also begin to recognize, well, I do identify God as a dangerous religious idea in my book, because I think that we do sometimes not trust each other based on what you believe about God if we think it's wrong. So, but when I talk about it as a dangerous religious idea, I don't mean to undermine it. I mean to strengthen faith with self-critical capacity. So I think that the more that we can do that with our own faiths and recognize the self-critical dimensions embedded deep in our faith to improve the way our religions unfold in the world, then there'll be more space for people who identify differently around religion.
Well, I'd like to thank you all for making space for us tonight in your calendars, and thank you for making space for each other and these rich exchange of ideas. It's been a pleasure. Thanks to the Institute of Politics, to Zinat for having us here tonight. What a delightful way to spend an evening. Thank you.
Thank you.